We'll be in Genesis chapter 6 today. Some of you are like me and some of you are not like me in the sense of I grew up going to Sunday school and hearing kind of the heroic stories of the Old Testament. And I grew up in Sunday school in the sense of that I love that we also, growing up in Sunday school, that we take some stories like Noah's Ark and we make awesome, great theological driven songs for kids to remember these stories like Noah's Ark. And so there's the theologically rich and deep song about Noah's Ark. Noah built with one hammer, one hammer, one hammer. Noah built with one hammer, then he built with two. Noah built with two hammers, two hammers, two hammers. Anybody else ever heard this beside me? Oh, there's some of you out there that have heard this. If we go fast forward to the end, it goes all the way to five hammers, which looks something like this. Noah built with five hammers, five hammers, five hammers. Noah built with five hammers. Just some theological depth to how Noah built the ark. It's important that he was able to hold a hammer between his toes. But I grew up in Sunday school hearing these heroic stories of Old Testament characters. And if we're being really honest, it kind of left me with a sense of two different things. One, kind of this sense of awe that these things happened, right? That there were hungry lions that decided to fast because Daniel was thrown into their midst. That there was this worldwide flood that destroyed all of humanity outside of Noah and his family. That there were stories of waters that parted upon demand and then unparted when they were told to unpart. That there were burning bushes that God spoke out of. That there were fiery chariots that came down from heaven and Ubered certain guys up to heaven, that there were walls that fell just on command, that there were skeletons that came to life. Like there's this sense of awe over these stories. At the same time, there is a sense of disconnect. Like, who are these people? Like, what does this have to do with kind of my daily, right? Like the sense of awe, but disconnection. Like that wasn't the everyday life that I knew and experienced. And so kind of as a result of that, there's this natural temptation to take these type of stories and kind of relegate them to ancient fairy tale type tales that were kind of disconnected from everyday life, that they just seem like that they seem like just kind of ancient old stories that didn't have a lot to do with every day. They were just things of the past, things of history, things that we read about that are in our Bible story books, and just ancient stories. It's kind of like the little kid that crawled up in his grandpa's lap and said, Pawpaw, were you on the ark? And Pawpaw said, no, I wasn't on the ark. And little Johnny said, then why didn't you drown? Like just old stories, right? They just seem like old stories. That was a joke. You guys didn't get that? That was a joke? Old, why didn't you drown? Like he thought his Pawpaw was that old. It's a sad. Anybody got a pen? I need to mark that one out. Like, never use again. Old and irrelevant stories, they can seem like. Also, it kind of left me with a sense of feeling very ordinary. You know what I'm talking about? Like, these things didn't happen in my life. These, what we called kind of heroes of the faith, man, they seemed superhuman in a lot of ways. They seemed almost kind of Supermanish or Batmanish. They seemed like these heroes that would defy kings, right? Kings that had the power to throw them in a fiery furnace or to take their lives. They would stand and defy them. They would face giants. They would take on these 9 feet tall, right, superhuman Goliath-type characters. These heroes of the faith seemed like they were undaunting. They would face lions and consequences and experience what seemed to be the impossible. And to be honest, when I read that, it makes my life seem kind of dull, kind of ordinary. It makes my faith seem kind of small. And it leaves us with those questions, like, does God still work in these type of extraordinary ways when I feel so ordinary? If we're being honest, I don't feel like a Noah. I don't feel like an Abraham or a Joseph, the characters that we'll talk about in the Genesis series. And so what happens is these biblical characters, they kind of become cartoons. They become heroes that are written in a storybook, and we miss the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that these stories are not about the people. These stories are about God. They're about the God of these people. These stories are about His redemptive story, that history is His story, and that these stories fit within this bigger story that is always pointing up and it's always pointing forward. It's always pointing up to God, to the God of these characters, and it's always pointing forward to the Messiah that would come and fulfill everything in these areas where these characters would fall short. And if we're being, again, super honest today, when we dig deep into these characters, we discover that the people in the Bible are very ordinary. They are flesh and blood people. They're fathers and husbands and spouses and children and parents and neighbors, and they lived very real lives. They dealt with very real issues. They lied and they deceived at times, and they scrambled to put things together, and they often took matters into their own hands and didn't trust in this God that they served and followed. They were very real people that dealt with very real issues, and they did very real things to try to get their ways. In other words, their faith was very authentic. It was full of ups and it was full of downs. It was back and forth and trusting and sometimes relying on my own strength, but they had a relationship with a very real God. And that's why God is the hero of every story. It's not these characters. The hero in these biblical accounts is not the character in the story. The hero is the God of the story. And this God does extraordinary things through very ordinary people to bring glory to Himself, to bring glory to God. That God is glorified through the redemptive storyline that we call the Bible. That this narrative, this story that we have labeled the Bible, is really this redemption story of a God who is pursuing a people, who is redeeming a people for His own glory. So these stories, like the story of Noah and the ones we'll look at in the next few weeks, they should not leave us feeling disconnected or inadequate or ordinary. They should leave us feeling encouraged. They should remind us of the lengths to which God has gone to make us a part of His redemptive story. God is the hero of these stories, and that's good news. And so that brings us to the story of Noah, which has to be one, again, the most popular stories of the Bible. And so what I've learned is that there's kind of two approaches to the Noah story. There's the kind of cartoon approach, the cutesy story of kind of this jolly zookeeper, and it's that story that we decorate our nurseries with, right? The characters that look very cartoonish. As a matter of fact, I was walking around the building yesterday when they were getting ready for VBS, and I was instructed to go empty all the trash, and so I went and did my duties as a husband to empty the trash in the building. And I went into our kind of Tykes nursery area and haven't been in kind of the second room in a while. And I realized it was a giant mural of the cartoony Noah's Ark. I think we've got unicorns in there, if I'm being honest. I think they're horses, but they look like unicorns to me, just without the horn. And so that's the cartoony depiction of the story of Noah's Ark. And that's fair. Like, you're not going to put a mural up on the nursery in your house of people drowning and screaming, right, in the Noah story. We're going to leave that part of the Noah story off of the nursery walls, okay? I don't want your kids going home with nightmares of what they saw on the walls at the nursery. So we're going to kind of keep the cartoony approach at times of the Noah story, the nursery decorations. The struggle is sometimes this type of approach makes its way into preaching as well. That we have a tendency sometimes to just make the story of Noah kind of cliche. As a matter of fact, I found this list of the top 10 cliches that came from actual sermons on the story of Noah's Ark. Okay, so these are things I will not be using in the story of Noah's Ark. But here's some. These are actual points or cliches that came out of actual sermons. It's a generous term on Noah's Ark. Number 10. Plan ahead. It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. Plan ahead. Number 9, stay fit. When you're 600 years old, someone might ask you to do something really big. Number 8, don't listen to your critics. Okay, I've heard that applied in the Noah story. Number 7, if you can't fight or flee, just float. These are things from actual sermons. Number 6, take care of your animals as if they were the last ones on earth. Remember that with your dog and cat. Number 5, no matter how stormy life gets, remember there's a rainbow on the other side. Aww. Number 4, these are actual sermon things. I mentioned that. When the doo-doo gets deep, don't just sit and complain, grab a shovel. Not going to be using that application today. Number 3, remember the ark was built by amateurs and the Titanic was built by professionals. Some of you have put that on your Facebook, I know. Number 2, remember that the woodpeckers inside the boat are often a bigger threat than the storm outside the boat. Number 1, whatever it takes, don't miss the boat. These are all things that have come out of Noah sermons. That's not the approach we're going to take today, but that's kind of the kind of cartoony, cliche approach to the Noah story. The opposite approach is what we just saw in that Inside Edition segment. It is kind of the Discovery Channel approach that focuses on the logistics, focuses on the mechanics of the Noah story, the where and the when and the how. And the picture up here is that's supposed to be where the ark came to its final resting place. And so there is that kind of Discovery Channel approach that either is setting out to prove or disprove the Noah story. And so they want to look at all those logistics. How could a flood take place? What would the damage be? All those type of things. We actually did have the opportunity to do the Ark Encounter in Kentucky last summer. During our summer vacation, we took a tour up into Ohio to do some things. We came back by and visited the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. So a couple of things about it. One, I'm telling the truth when I say this. Not that I wouldn't otherwise, but you know what I'm saying. Literally, our entire trip was rainless, no rain, until we got to the exit where the ark was, and then it came a monsoon. Like, I felt like they staged it. Like, it hasn't been raining the entire trip, and when we came to the ark, I'm not kidding, it started pouring rain when we pulled into the parking lot of the Ark Encounter. And then the second thing I want to say about the Ark Encounter is the irony of all ironies, is you have not kept up with the news, is the Ark Encounter right now is suing their insurance company because of a flooding issue. I'm not kidding. The Ark Encounter is suing over flooding that has taken place. So there's just a twist and a sense of humor about the Ark Encounter. But if you do the Ark Encounter, a lot of it's driven by the kind of the mechanics behind it, the logistics behind it. So here's what I would say about the whole kind of argument about the historicity of Noah and the ark. I embrace the historicity of this event because Jesus talked about it, okay? And so Jesus references it twice in the New Testament. And again, my faith is kind of driven by this, that Jesus said it, and Jesus came back to life, and I didn't. I'm with him. And so I stick with him. And so when he talks about the historicity of the story of Noah, I embrace it. I don't know all the science and all the things behind it that drive some of the questions, but because Jesus referenced it twice, then I'm going to go with him, that this is a historical event that did take place. And I know that one day we'll kind of be exposed to how it took place and all those things. But most importantly for our message today, like, what does the story of Noah teach us about God and our faith, and ultimately about Jesus, because we believe everything again in the Old Testament is kind of pointing forward to the Jesus of the New Testament. So we'll bounce into chapter 6 and verse 5 and pick up. We're not going to read the entire story, but we'll look at certain texts through the story and kind of walk through the remainder. So chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And so we drop into the story, and again, we're fast forwarding from everything that happened in Genesis 3, where we were last week. A lot of things happened between 3 and 6, but we're not making our way through every story in Genesis, so we're kind of bumping forward to chapter 6. So by the time we reach chapter 6 and the story of Noah from chapter 3 and the fall in the garden, lots of people have been born, multiple generations, and the text says that the world was very depraved. As a matter of fact, the text indicates that every inclination of our hearts was on evil all the time. I believe that kind of represents the depravity of the human heart, that we are the same way, that we are born into this world as sinners, and that we have depraved hearts, and that our hearts are desperately wicked, Jeremiah says. And so the inclination of our heart outside of Jesus is towards sin. That every inclination of the heart is towards sin. And then there's the reality of this text that says that grieved God. That sin grieves God. That God is grieved by sin. And then the writer gives us some kind of historical narrative here. He helps us understand, and to the extent that he says, like, God regretted creating humans. Now, again, he's using language that kind of helps us understand what was going on here. It's not like God sits in heaven and grieves because he's above time. We talked about all that in week 1. But he's putting it into language that we get, like God was grieved by the sin of humanity. Verse 7, the story continues. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So again, this is language that we can understand, that God declares judgment on sin. We learn in the New Testament the wages of sin is death. The consequences of sin is death. And so what's happening in the story here is that God allows sin to run its natural course, which always ends in death and judgment. Same in our lives today. We say this frequently at City Church, that sin will play itself out in your life. The sin will lead to death and destruction. Sin kills things. It destroys relationships. It destroys things in your life. The consequences of sin is always death. And so God declares judgment on sin in this story. He will allow sin to run its course. He will allow judgment to take place. Verse 8, we begin to get a glimpse of the gospel here. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So amid the depravity, in the middle of this depraved culture where hearts were inclined toward evil, there was one, and the translation here is there's one who found favor with God. And the way that this is translated is the idea is not that Noah found favor because of how righteous he was. This is not about Noah. This is God's unmerited grace on Noah. That Noah found favor in God, that God displayed grace toward Noah amid the depravity. The name Noah carries with it the idea of one who is resting, one who is at peace with God. So even the implication of his name is that Noah was resting in who God is, that he found favor in God's eyes, that God displayed grace amid the depravity. Verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And so there's kind of this threefold description of Noah. That's the idea of righteousness. In other words, he was made right by God. And because of the righteousness of God, he made right decisions in his everyday life. So again, the implication of salvation here, that as we follow Christ, that is the righteousness of Christ that enables us to live righteous in the world that we live in. And so he is righteous before God. The word is used here that he is blameless. That has the idea of almost this kind of center of gravity in his life, that he was centered. In other words, he found completion in God. He was made whole in God. That's the idea of being blameless. And then that he walked with God. This is moment by moment relationship with God. And so we have this picture of Noah amid the depravity of one who has found favor with God. In other words, God has bestowed his grace upon Noah, which enables Noah to make right decisions, to have this center of gravity about who he is. He is a God-centered person that enables him to make moment by moment right decisions in everyday life. So we'll see how the gospel applies to that toward the end of the message today. But we kind of have that picture of Noah. Amid the wickedness, there's this God follower. This God follower who is a recipient of God's grace, who is a recipient of God's salvation. And so again, we put this into the bigger structure of the Bible. We put this into the bigger framework, and we see that God's story of redemption is pushing forward. Amid the depravity, amid the wickedness, amid the idea that their hearts were turned away from God, we see God's story of redemption continues. No matter how wicked, no matter how depraved, that God continues to push his story of redemption through all of human history. That there is Noah, this picture of God's grace amid all of this depravity. So, verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch, which was this kind of dark adhesive type stuff. Maybe we needed some pitch for our mural back here. Those of you that don't know, when we came in this morning, all this was laying in the floor. And so duct tape is not the cure-all. Maybe pitch is the cure-all. You're like me, pitch, like, isn't that what you do with a baseball? But God instructs Noah, right, to build this boat. In spite of the corruption, and this word corrupt is used over and over, with the idea, again, that we are corrupt before God. Amidst the corruption, God provides salvation. He provides a way out. His instructions are, build this big boat. It's 500 feet, right, long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. Again, there's no boat prior to this. And so it's like, here's the instruction, the blueprint, go build this boat. And then we know the rest of the story. It's like, bring lots of animals on board. Animals of every kind are going to come on board. Man, do you guys think about the things I think about, like in the Noah story? Like, man, there had to be like a big stench problem on this boat. Like, what did they do with all this stuff? Like, just the natural, right, what happens when animals eat? Like, what happens? They're like pitching that stuff outside, or what's going on? And then this is my bigger question that I just want to ask Noah when we all get to heaven. Like, man, mosquitoes. Like, one swat could have cured so many problems. Like, 2 mosquitoes on the boat. I mean, just like that could have solved so many issues for us that live here in Alabama. Are you with me? Like, these are the questions I want to ask Noah. 2 roaches, really? I mean, it's a foot stomp. There's just things, and maybe that did happen. Maybe there were some more annoying creatures than mosquitoes that we'll never know about because there was an accidental swat that happened on the boat. But these are the places where my mind goes sometimes, thinking about how the logistics of all this. How did all this take place? But God says the world will be destroyed by a flood. And Noah says, what's a flood? I mean, it's the reality of Noah's taking steps of faith and obedience here outside of his own understanding. And then verse 18, God establishes this covenant with Noah, this promise with Noah. I will establish my covenant with you, and you will come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. So God initiates, he establishes what we call a covenant, a promise. It is always a promise between God and humanity. It is often a one-sided covenant. As we'll see in the story of Abraham in a few weeks, that God establishes a covenant where God is the keeper of the covenant because we're incapable of keeping the covenant on our end. And so God initiates and he establishes this covenant of salvation and protection and grace. And again, the redemptive theme of God pushes forward, that God initiates deliverance for his people. He's pointing forward to the ultimate deliverer, Jesus. And so let's be honest, like, Noah has every right to question here. Like, boat, what's a boat? Flood, what's a flood? Every animal, like, how's that going to take place? Like, this is, again, where that kind of disconnect happens when you think about the details of the story. That Noah has every right to question what God is telling him in light of everything he's known up to that point. In verse 22, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. So while Noah has every right to question, he simply believes God. He makes the right decision to trust God today and to trust God with the rest. Like, I think that's kind of the framework Noah had to exist in. Like, today I'm going to choose to get up and obey God today. I'm going to drive the next nail in the ark today. I don't know what's coming for him decades from now, years from now. I don't know how all this plays out. I know what God's told me to do, and today I'm going to get up and I'm going to choose to drive the next nail into the next board in the ark. That's the indication of the Noah making moment-to-moment right decisions with God, walking with God in the everyday. Today. Now, you know there were days that Noah was discouraged. You know there was days that the hands were too callous to want to work. You know there was the days that his back hurt and all these things that were going on. And every day Noah had to make the choice. Today I'm going to get up. I'm going to trust God with today. And I'm going to swing the hammer today. And I'm going to trust that God has the big picture, that God has the rest in control. And there's a faith factor here that we can relate with when it comes to the story of Noah. So I want to encourage you today that common sense and intelligence will only take you so far with God. You get that? Common sense and just straight out logic and intelligence will only take you so far when you're dealing with a sovereign God. Because God often operates beyond our human capacity to understand and to grasp. He's bigger. What does Isaiah say? His ways are beyond mine. His thoughts are higher than mine. I can't always get God. I can't always understand God. And when I'm trying to figure God out, it's just not going to happen at times because God is bigger. And guess what? I want that size God. I don't want a God I can always figure out. I don't want a God that's always logical and makes sense in my mind. You know why? Because that limits him to what I can think and do. We want a God who's bigger than that, who has the big picture in mind, who understands more and broader and deeper than our human minds can grasp. And that is the bridge where faith steps into. Am I going to trust God when it doesn't even make sense to do so? When it goes beyond my common sense and what I have figured out and what's logical in my mind, because God operates beyond that capacity. And that's where faith comes in, that I can trust God even in the face of what appears to be impossible. And so our challenge is, will I trust God in those moments in life? Will I trust God in those moments when it seems impossible? Will I trust God in the face of broken relationships? Will I trust God in the face of rebellious kids? Will I trust God in the possibility of loss of employment? Will I trust God in overcoming this addiction? Will I trust God with an unbelieving spouse? Will I trust God? Will I prioritize God in my life when the bank account says it makes no sense to trust God with your money or to give? Will I trust God in those moments? Will I trust God with my unknown future? Will I trust God when I can't see what's around the corner? Will I trust God with this sickness? Will I trust God with that diagnosis? Will I trust God when there is no diagnosis? I just know that something's going on I can't explain. Like, will I trust God in those moments when my human mind, my human capacity can't figure it out? That's the faith factor. That's what faith is. It's having that confidence, right? This, the Hebrew writer describes it as that faith, that trust, that confidence in things that are not seen. And that's where faith is. And that's what we see faith in Noah's story. That he's going to simply obey and trust God in the moment to moment. And so when we come to the Noah story, like Noah is an example for us in this season of his life of what it means to simply believe and obey God. To believe God, to take God at his word, to obey God, to follow God's word, to take God at his word and to follow God at his word. There's the old classic hymn that I grew up in church singing, trust and obey. Am I going to trust? Am I going to believe? And am I going to obey? Am I going to get up and swing the hammer today? When I can't see the big picture or how long this is going to last, am I going to trust and obey? So let me say this here. We can learn from Noah right here, but we also see later in the Noah story that Noah's faith falters. It's human faith. And we're reminded through that part of the Noah story that Jesus succeeds where Noah fails. Like, don't miss that. This points us to the gospel. Jesus succeeds where Noah fails. In this moment, we learn from Noah to be faithful and to swing the hammer the next day. Like, we get what Noah's going through, to believe God and obey God with the unknown. But we're also reminded that our eyes are not turned to Noah. Our eyes are turned to Jesus. By the way, it took Noah 120 years to build the ark. 120 years. It took these guys 6 years to build the ark in Kentucky. Let you know how far technology has gone. 120 years to build the ark. And as far as we know, there's no like heads up. There's no like, hey, let me send you a preliminary shower just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. This is what rain looks like. And hey, let's make sure the boat floats before you get on. There's none of that. It's just like get up, swing the hammer, follow the dimensions, do what I told you. 120 years. 120 years of doubts and uncertainty and persistence and up and down and patience, like everything that defines our ordinary faith in everyday life is what Noah went through. 120 years. Everything that defines our faith in a sovereign God, the doubts and the insecurities and the ups and downs and hills and valleys, everything that defines our real human faith is what Noah went through. 120 years of it. Like, I get impatient after a week. Like, If I'm asking God for something or praying about something and I don't feel like I've got clear direction after a week, I'm like, well, I got to figure this out on my own, I guess. Like, think about, 12 decades, like over a century of swinging the hammer day in and day out. Noah is faithful. And so, again, the question for us is like, do I trust God? When time lingers on, will I trust Him? When God is silent, will I trust Him? When my prayers seem to go unanswered, will I trust Him? When the enemy is whispering in my ear to give up or to throw in the towel, like, will I trust Him? Will I trust Him when I feel like I'm the only one? Well, sure enough, after a century, it happens just as God said. God gets Noah in the ark, and it begins to rain. Chapter 7, verse 17, the flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated. The ark floated. Woo! The ark floated on the face of the waters. After 120 years, you hope the boat floats. The ark floated on the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole earth were covered. And so again, 40 days, 40 nights of this flooding, and obviously most biblical scholars don't believe it was just rain, but the waters from the center of the earth or from the earth itself were rising, and so things were happening. But this flood took place. The world is destroyed, and again, if we're just getting to the point here, God judges sinful rebels in the story. And the rebellious are judged for their sin. And while this story points forward to a Savior and a Redeemer, it also reminds us in the story that this is a precursor for a preview for a final judgment that's facing all of humanity. That all of us in one day will face the judgment of God. But in this story of judgment, is a story that's laced with grace, isn't it? It is a story of a grace thread that runs through the story of God. That God has spared Noah and his family. And this is a precursor of this God of salvation, this God of redemption. That God will spare the family of Noah, will spare Noah and his family. So amidst the judgment, amidst the sin running its course and facing the judgment of God, just like it will again one day happen, amidst that, there's a story of redemption. There's a story of grace. There's a story of salvation. And Noah and his family are spared. Some scholars actually translate Noah, Noe, N-O-E, which, interesting enough, is the family name on let me get this right, my grandmother, who is still alive in assisted living care, who is the, obviously, mother of my father. My grandmother's side of the family was the Noe family, N-O-E. So I guess we can trace our lineage all the way back to Noah and the ark, that Noes still survive. I don't know any Noes that are still surviving, but there was a Noe family. My great-grandfather's name was Oscar Alton Noe, and my great-grandmother's name was Annie Bell Noe. There's some southern, names right there. The Noe family. And so the Noe family was spared way back in Genesis chapter 6. They remain on the boat. And the boat is there for another 150 days. The rain is there before the water secedes, where they can finally get off the boat. And I almost think that chapter 8 and verse 1 is almost comical. It's kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Again, chapter 8, verse 1, this is after the 150 days of floating around after the flood. Chapter 8, verse 1, but God remembered Noah. Thankfully, God remembered Noah. Didn't just leave him out there floating around. He remembered Noah was out there, and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. And so God again remembers, thankfully, that Noah's out there on the boat. And then there's this disembarking process that you can read about on your own. Noah sends out these birds, and the birds come back when there's no land, and then one comes back with a leaf in his beak, and then he sends out a bird that doesn't come back, so it kind of lets Noah know, all right, it's time to disembark. And so sure enough, the ark comes to rest. We saw the scientific picture where some people believe is still in the Middle East, where the ark came to rest on what the scriptures is called Mount Ararat, but the ark comes to rest. Noah gets off the boat, and the first thing he does is offer sacrifices to God. That makes sense. Talking about the moment where you want to kiss the ground. after getting off the ark, let's kiss the ground. You've seen those times where people were captured and brought back, or on the moon and came back, and they got down on their hands and knees and kissed the earth because they were back safe. This is a kiss the earth moment for Noah. Gets off the boat. He offers sacrifices, which, by the way, really stinks for those animals that survived and they were brought onto the boat. And then as soon as they get off the boat, bam, you're getting sacrificed. So for those lambs, it was not a win. But Noah offers sacrifices to God in celebration, and God confirms his covenant by saying, I'll never destroy the earth again with flood. And he puts what in the sky? The rainbow. Scripture actually says it's his bow, like God's bow. And so God puts the rainbow in the sky to mark that he will never destroy the earth by flood again. And what I just told you, that rainbow promise, God will never destroy the earth. Matter of fact, let's read it. Verse 12 of chapter 9, God said, this is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature that's with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And so God makes this covenant with all the earth. He will never destroy it by flood through this means again. And God comes through in a godlike way. And Noah, in the process, makes all the storybooks. All right? That's why he's in there. This story. Noah makes the storybooks. Listen. This part of his story makes the storybooks. There's a whole kind of rest of the story with Noah that doesn't make the storybooks. You know why? Because it shows us that Noah was human and that our eyes are not on Noah. That this story is really a story of grace. It is salvation amid depravity. Noah's depravity. That God would redeem sinful Noah and sinful humanity. And so we read this story, we recap this story, we hear the story, and again we think like and disconnect. Like, what does this have to do with my everyday? What does this have to do with tomorrow? What does this have to do with work and school and sitting in the car rider line? Like, what does this have to do with homework and sitting in a cubicle? What does this have to do with paying my bills when I'm not sure if the check's going to make it through? Like, what does it teach us? So let me just remind us of a few things about God and us and Jesus through this story. I would say, first of all, it reminds us that we do live in a broken world. We live in a broken world. Like, we read this story that their hearts were inclined toward evil continually, and it reminds us that we are broken people too, that we live in a broken world. That Noah was broken. That we are born into depravity. That our hearts and minds are on evil continually. That our souls are corrupt without gospel intervention. It's reflective of our own hearts. It's reflective of our culture. That we are a culture of broken homes and broken lives and broken people. That we live in a broken world that is filled with broken things. That is filled with addiction and violence and abuse and perversion and deception and immorality and whatever else we want to add to the list. Like, we live in a broken world that impacts us. It impacts us spiritually. It impacts us relationally. It impacts us mentally. It impacts us physically, right? Our bodies get sick because we live in a broken world. Like, the world around us has issues because it's a broken world. Like, sin impacts everything about the world in which we live. Our lives individually and globally are impacted because we live in a broken world. We identify with what was going on in Genesis 6 because we are born into corruption, just like Noah and his comrades. We live in a broken world, which reminds us of the gospel that God redeems the broken. God brings salvation to the broken. God redeems the brokenness. There is salvation amid depravity. The short cliche that we often say is Jesus saves. That means that Jesus redeems. Jesus brings salvation. So listen to this. It's very important. Noah's ability to build the ark and survive the flood did not include any power to escape the corruption of his own heart. We see that in the rest of the Noah story. Noah's ability to obey God, to build this massive boat, to deliver his family and these animals, Noah's ability to follow God's instruction, all these things, Noah's ability to do those things did not save Noah from the depravity of his own heart. He needed a redeemer to do that, a savior. That's why the Noah story points ahead. Noah was broken, but we have hope because of this. because Jesus is the greater Noah. Jesus is greater than Noah. Jesus is the greater Noah of this story. You see, we love the story of Noah, but there needed to be another Noah story. Another Noah story that does not end, if you read the rest of the Noah story, another Noah story that does not end in sin. Another Noah story that does not end in curses because of Noah's disobedience. Another Noah story that ends with consistent obedience, faithfulness, salvation, and a guaranteed promise that final judgment will never be needed. Jesus brings us that better story because he is the greater Noah. Jesus' story does not end in curses. It does not end in sin. It does not end with God having to denounce Noah for his unfaithfulness. The story of Jesus ends in victory and salvation and redemption because Jesus did what Noah could not do. Jesus lived without sin. Jesus fulfilled the promises of God. Jesus is the greater Noah. Jesus delivers us from judgment, just as the ark did for Noah. And while a wooden ark delivered Noah from physical death, a wooden cross delivers us from spiritual death. Did you hear me? A wooden ark delivered Noah from physical death, but it took a wooden cross to deliver us from spiritual death. Noah obeyed God by climbing onto the boat to save a few. Jesus obeyed his heavenly Father by climbing onto a cross to save the many. Jesus is the man that Noah never could be. Jesus is the greater Noah. And we anticipate the day when the one who is greater than Noah will return. And God's promises will be fulfilled in their entirety. Not by a rainbow in the sky that promises he will not flood the earth again, but God's promises will be fulfilled that those who have taken refuge in the eternal ark will embark into eternity with our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. In the meantime, we're Noah in the sense of we need to rest in who God is. As Noah's name indicates, we rest in our ark. We rest in who Jesus is. We rest in Jesus, the ark, and we follow God in the everyday. What does that mean? Exactly what it meant for Noah. Jesus is the greater Noah. Jesus is the ark. We rest in him. Our faith is in him. He declares us righteous. And as we are declared righteous in Christ, we make everyday right decisions. Not based on my own self-righteousness, not based on how good I am. We make right decisions because I have been gifted the righteousness of Jesus. I rest in him. I make right decisions because of my standing with him. I make everyday right decisions today. Today I choose to do right. Today I choose to make the right decisions. Today I choose to obey. Not because I want to somehow please God, but because of who I am in God. Resting in who Jesus is, resting in the ark, we make everyday right decisions. I don't want you to ever hear a message from the stage of City Church that somehow makes you think that it is your everyday right decisions that somehow make you presentable before God. It is the exact opposite. It is the right decisions of Jesus, who is the greater Noah, that enables us to make everyday right decisions. You get that? That's the gospel. Don't miss the gospel in the Noah story. It's not because Noah was somehow this right dude amidst all the depravity that God looked down and said, well, I kind of like that guy. I'm going to go tell him to build an ark. It is always that God is always the hero of the story. It is always God that bestows his grace on sinful humanity and enables us to live out our faith in everyday life. Everyday right decisions. Also, what about this idea of blameless living? Noah, it says, lived blamelessly among his generation. What does that mean? It means that he was God-centered. It is because of the righteousness of Christ, because I rest in the ark of Jesus, that Jesus becomes the center of my life. That Jesus is the heart of who I am. that I'm a follower of Jesus, that I am resting in the ark, that I am making right decisions, that I am living this Jesus-centered life because I am resting in the ark. I am resting in the greater Noah. Everyday right decisions, blameless living, Jesus-centeredness. And then, I like this phrase about Noah that he did these things in his generation. You know what that means is that Noah was a man whose life was marked by grace in his generation, in his people, in his day and age. That we are a people whose eyes, like we read this morning, our eyes are cast forward to that day of final hope and rest in God, our eternal home. But in the meantime, we exist in the here and now as everyday people, resting in Jesus, making right decisions in the moment, choosing to swing the hammer because of what Christ has done on our behalf, seeking to have a Jesus-centered life based on what Jesus has done. We are people whose lives are marked by grace in this generation, in your family, in your workplace, in your school. That it is a life marked by grace. That is a life marked by what Jesus has done on my behalf. The way we say it in our core values here at City Church is that grace is a way of life. That when I have been given so much grace and recognize it and understand it and rest in it, then I will by nature live out a grace-filled life in my generation, among my people, among my family, my friends, my coworkers, the people that get on my nerves, that person that needs to hear the gospel. Like, I will live a life marked by grace. How? Why? I will do it because there is a greater Noah. And I will take refuge in him. I will take refuge in the ark. I will take refuge in the greater Noah. The greater Noah who will not disappoint, who will not let me down, who will not fail me, who will not turn his back on me. I will rest in the greater Noah who took upon himself my sin, who died on a wooden cross to bring final salvation and final deliverance for those that will be drawn into the ark of God, that will live in the security of the ark, that will experience the life of the ark just now and for all of eternity. So I want to encourage you today, follower of Jesus. May your eyes rest on the greater Noah. May you live life understanding what it means to be protected in the refuge, the safety of the ark. And when you begin to grasp that, when we begin to get the gospel, and this is a journey for me too, when we begin to grasp the gospel, you know what it does? It impacts my everyday. My right decisions, my blamelessness, my Jesus-centeredness, my moment by moment by moment walk with God, not trying to earn his favor, but because of the favor that has been bestowed upon me, living it out in my everyday moment by moment. And guess what? When I get knocked down, when sin gets its way, when the enemy wins by whispering in my ear and knocks me down, guess what? I rest in the ark. I get back up. I rest in who Jesus is, what Jesus has done. I'm back into the rhythm, right, of every day, moment by moment, swinging the hammer. When I get punched in the face and knocked down and can't figure it out, I rest in the ark. I rest in what Jesus has done. My righteousness is not dictated by when I get punched and knocked down. My righteousness is in the ark. My righteousness is in the greater Noah. And so I get back up with gospel-centered living. I turn back to Jesus. I rest in Jesus because Jesus is the greater Noah. Would you say that with me? Say it. Jesus is the greater Noah. Say it like you mean it. Jesus is the greater Noah. Because ultimately, Jesus is the ark. Take refuge in him today.